Chapter 27. Mike TV is sent by television. Mike TV was even more excited than Grandpa Joe at seeing a bar of chocolate being sent by television. "But, Mr. Wonka," he shouted, "can you send other things through the air in the same way? Breakfast cereal, for instance?" "Oh, my sainted aunt," cried Mr. Wonka, "don't mention that disgusting stuff in front of me. Don't you know what breakfast cereal is made of? It's made of all those tiny little wooden curly shavings you find in pencil sharpenings." "But could you send it by television if you wanted to?" said Mike TV. "Of course I could." "And what about people?" asked Mike TV in another way. "A person?" cried Mr. Wonka. "Are you off your rocker?" "But could it be done?" "Good heavens, child, I really don't know. I suppose it could, yes. I'm pretty sure it could. Of course it could. I wouldn't like to risk it, though. It might have some very nasty consequences." But Mike TV is already off and running. The moment he heard Mr. Wonka saying, "I'm pretty sure it could, of course it could," he turned away and started running as fast as he could towards the other end of the room where the great camera was standing. "Look at me," he shouted as I ran. "I'm going to be the first TV person in the world to be sent by television." "No, no, no," cried Mr. Wonka. "Mike," screamed Mrs. TV, "stop, come back. You'll be turned into a million tiny pieces." But there was no stopping Mike TV now. The crazy boy rushed on, and when he reached the enormous camera, he jumped straight for the switch, scattering Oompa Loompas left and right as he went. "See you later, alligator," he shouted, and he pulled down the switch. As he did so, he leapt into the full glare of the almighty lens. There was a blinding flash, then there was silence. Then Mrs. TV ran forward. But she stopped dead in the middle of the room, and she stood there. She stood staring at the place where her son had been, and her great red mouth opened wide, and she screamed, "He's gone! He's gone!" "Great heavens, he has gone!" shouted Mr. TV. Mr. Wonka hurried forward and placed a hand gently on Mrs. TV's shoulder. "We shall have to hope for the best," he said. "We must pray that your little boy will come out unharmed at the other end." "Mike!" screamed Mrs. TV, clasping her head in her hands. "Where are you?" "I'll tell you where he is," said Mr. TV. "He's whizzing around somewhere above our heads in a million tiny pieces." "Don't talk about it," wailed Mrs. TV. "We must watch the television set," Mr. Wonka said. "He may come through at any moment." Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe and little Charlie and Mr. Wonka all gathered round the television and stared intensely at the screen. The screen was blank. "He's taking a heck of a long time to come across," said Mr. TV, wiping his brow. Oh dear," said Mr. Wonka. "I do hope that no part of him gets left behind." "What on earth do you mean?" asked Mr. TV sharply. "I don't wish to alarm you," said Mr. Wonka, "but it does sometimes happen that only about half the little pieces find their way into the television set. It happened last week. I don't know why, but the result was that only half a bar of chocolate came through." Mrs. TV let a scream of horror. "You mean only half of Mike is coming back?" she cried. "Let's hope it's the top half," said Mr. TV. "Hold everything," said Mr. Wonka. "Watch the screen. Something's happening." The screen had suddenly begun to flicker. Then some wavy lines appeared. Mr. Wonka adjusted one of the knobs and the wavy lines went away. And now, very slowly, the screen began to get brighter and brighter. "Here he comes," yelled Mr. Wonka. "Yes, that's him all right." "Is he all in one piece?" cried Mrs. TV. "I'm not sure," said Mr. Wonka. "It's too early to tell." There you go. Can you see Mr. Wonka, Mr. and Mrs. TV? And all of these pieces could be Mike TV flying across the sky. Faintly at first, but becoming clearer and clearer every second, the picture of Mike TV appeared on the screen. He was standing up and waving at the audience and grinning from ear to ear. But he's a midget, shouted Mr. TV. Mike, cried Mr. TV, are you all right? Are there any tiny bits of you missing? Is he going to get any bigger? Shouted Mr. TV. Talk to me, Mike, cried Mrs. TV. Say something. Tell me you're okay. A tiny little voice, no louder than a squeaking of a mouse, came out of the television set. Hi, Mum, it said. Hi, Pop. Look at me. I'm the first person ever to be sent by television. Grab him, quick, ordered Mr. Wonka. Mrs. TV shot out a hand and picked the tiny figure of Mike TV out of the screen. Hooray, shouted Mr. Wonka. He's all in one piece. He's completely unharmed. You call that unharmed? Snapped Mrs. TV, peering at the little speck of a boy who was now running to and from across the palm of her hand, waving his pistols in the air. He's certainly no more than an inch tall. He's shrunk, said Mr. TV. Well, of course he's shrunk, said Mr. Wonka. What did you expect? This is terrible, wailed Mrs. TV. What are we going to do? And Mr. TV said, we can't send him back to school like this. He'll get trodden on. He'll get squished. There he is, look. Can you see him running round in Mrs. TV's hand? Serves him right, doesn't it? He should have listened. We won't be able to do anything, cried Mrs. TV. Oh, yes, I will, squeaked the tiny voice of Mike TV. I'll still be able to watch television. Never again, shouted Mr. TV. I'm throwing the television set out of the window the moment we get home. I've had enough of television. When he heard this, Mike TV flew into a terrible temper tantrum. He started jumping up and down on the palm of his mother's hand, screaming and yelling and trying to bite her fingers. I want to watch television, he squeaked. I want to watch television. I want to watch television. I want to watch television. Here, give him to me, said Mr. TV, and he took the tiny boy and shoved him into the breast pocket of his jacket and stuffed a handkerchief on top. Squeals and yells came from inside the pocket, and the pocket shook as the furious little prisoner fought to get out. Oh, Mr. Wonka, wailed Mrs. TV, how can we make him grow? Oh, well, said Mr. Wonka, stroking his beard and gazing thoughtfully at the ceiling. I must say, this is a wee bit tricky. But small boys are extremely springy and elastic. They'll stretch. So what we'll do, we'll put him in a special machine I have for testing the stretchiness of chewing gum. Maybe that'll bring him back to what he was. Oh, thank you, cried Mrs. TV. Don't mention it, dear lady. How far do you think he'll stretch? Asked Mr. TV. Maybe miles, said Mr. Wonka. Who knows? But he's going to be awfully thin. Everything gets thinner when you stretch it. You mean like chewing gum? Asked Mr. TV. Exactly. That's how thin he will be. I haven't the foggiest idea, said Mr. Wonka. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because we'll soon fatten him up again. And we'll have to do is give him a couple triple doses of my wonderful supervitamin chocolate. Supervitamin chocolate contains huge amounts of vitamin A and vitamin B. It also contains vitamin C, D, E, F, G, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, T, U, V, W, X, Y. And believe it or not, vitamin Z. The only two vitamins it does not have are the rare vitamin S, because it makes you sick, and vitamin H, because it makes horns grow out the top of your head like a bull. But it does have a very small amount of the rarest and most magical vitamin of them all, vitamin Wonka. And what does that do to him? Asked Mr. TV. It'll make his toes grow out until they're as long as his fingers. Oh no, cried Mrs. TV. Don't be silly, said Mr. Wonka. It's most useful. He'll be able to play the piano with his feet. But Mr. Wonka! No arguments, please, said Mr. Wonka. He turned away and clicked his fingers 3 times in the air, An Oompa Loompa appeared immediately and stood behind him. "Follow these orders," said Mr. Wonka, handing the Oompa Loompa a piece of paper on which he had written full instructions. "You'll find the boy in his father's pocket. Off you go. Bye-bye, Mr. TV. Goodbye, Mrs. TV. Please don't look so worried. They all come out in the wash, you know, every one of them." At the end of the room, the Oompa Loompas around the giant camera were already beating their tiny drums and beginning to jog up and down to the rhythm. "There they go again," said Mr. Wonka. "I'm afraid you can't stop them singing." Little Charlie caught Grandpa Joe's hand, and the two of them stood beside Mr. Wonka in the middle of the long, bright room, listening to the Oompa Loompas as they sang. Now, the Mike TV song again is very long, and it is on Google. All right. There's a picture of the Oompa Loompas around the TV camera. Right, let's have a look. 1, 2, 3, 4 pages long, that song. The next chapter is called Only Charlie Left. That's for tomorrow. Bye-bye. Don't get caught in TV now.